Stories don't define you. How you tell them will.
Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. Many of my clients reach out to me because they're in transition. Their children are hitting milestone ages. They want more from their work. They're hitting a big number birthday. And they want to develop clarity about their natural strengths, what their next adventure might look like. In this series, you'll hear me ask my guests questions to dig deeply into the stories that shaped their lives, stories that uncover patterns and may unveil insights into dissatisfaction, and also where their strengths lie and where they found and continue to find joy. This podcast's intention is to have listeners think of their own related stories and how they tell them, discovering the internal messages that are limiting their success, and discovering how to shift their stories so they become positive life lessons to move them forward. If you're curious about what it would be like to work with me, visit elkinsconsulting.com and schedule a one-time 90-minute StrengthsFinder session.
Well, today is kind of a special day. I get to interview my friend John Dunia, who is known as the Shame Doctor. And the reason this is special is because we talked about 2 years ago about his being a guest on my podcast, and it never really happened. And then one of our mutual friends, Charlotte Wittenkamp, sent me an email and said, I just got to know John and you should interview him for your podcast. I know you guys would connect well. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's right. He fell off my radar. And I'm so excited to finally get a chance to visit with you. So John, thank you so much for joining me on Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will.
Thank you very much. I really feel honored to be with you here today, Sarah. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always get started by asking my guests to share something about themselves that most people might not know, that something that's not on your LinkedIn profile or your bio, and certainly not something on the jacket cover of your new book. But what do you think? Do you have something you could share with the audience?
Certainly. I started off in my college days studying music. And I have a degree in music. I started off as a comp major, but then I ended up shifting over to performance. I play the trumpet, and I play in a local symphony here in Henderson, Nevada.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
And we are going to play Mahler's First Symphony. Sorry, a little plug here. But if you're not familiar with that symphony, it is a bear for the trumpets. And I can't miss a day of practice, or I'm going to be hurting.
Wow. I always think about the embouchure that a trumpet requires, the lip position and strength for trumpet, and most of those horns, the trombone, the French horn. One of my friends plays the French horn with the Helena Symphony, and wow, that's an amazing accomplishment to be playing the trumpet in a symphony. Congratulations!
Oh, well, thank you. I should do something with my degree. That's about the only thing I do with it. But.
Well, I guess that's not unusual. 20 years ago, I read that only 15% of people actually go into the area of business or industry that they graduated with a degree from.
Yeah.
So, and I'm guessing those are generally medical and law, but I don't know. I continue to use my degree. My degree is in business. So, but really, musicians are very well known for being very versatile when it comes to business and work. So I'm sure that you've applied a lot of that, your degree program, what you learned socially, listening skills, mathematics. There's so many things that go into a music degree that people just have no idea.
Yeah. There is. I actually was early on. I was teaching. I taught trumpet. I did teach junior high band. Again, that was in my late 20s. And I also repaired band instruments. That I really enjoyed because you got to interact a lot with kids, and you could also help them out and kind of encourage them when they'd come to get their instrument fixed. And I got a couple of funny stories there, but that's beside the point.
No, that's not beside the point. That's exactly the point. Yeah, share one of your stories.
Two quick stories. This lady brought her saxophone in to get repaired for her son, and I was looking at it, and I asked, well, how much do you practice? And the parent looked at me and says, practice? My son's good. He doesn't need to practice. And I thought, oh my, okay, I'm not even going to touch this one with a 10-foot pole. And here's one of my favorite stories. When you see certain things, like, if somebody comes in with a trumpet and their mouthpiece is stuck and the whole lead pipe is torn off, the father just grabbed the wrench and tried to take it off himself. That happens so many times. But there's this one person brought in a flute, and there's a dent right in the middle, and it basically the flute's sitting on a bed, and somebody sits on it inadvertently, and so this lady brings the flute in, and I look at it and go, "Oh, so you sat on your flute, huh?" And she turns to her son and goes, "You told me you didn't sit on your flute." I'm like, oh, I busted him.
Busted is right. Oh, my gosh. I bet you have a lot of those.
Yep. Yeah, some good ones.
Was there ever gum in one of those, woodwind or horns?
I'm sure there was nothing that really stands out in my mind, that was causing the issue, but I'm sure there were, yeah.
Yeah, I remember when I stopped playing my flute, it was because I got braces and I had a really hard time getting my embouchure back, lifting my lips over my braces to be able to get a good sound out of my flute. And so I stopped. But what's interesting is that during COVID, I picked it up again because I still had my original Artley flute. And I brought it to the local music shop to tune it up, get it back to looking nice and polished, and replace some of the pads. And the young man who fixed my flute actually played in the orchestra with my son.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, which was so great. They were in middle school together. He's a phenomenal musician himself. And he fixed my flute for me, Jared. And I remember coming back to it last year, and I could actually get pretty good sound with it. And I got one of those original first-year band books.
Yeah.
And just went through the whole thing over the course of like a couple months, and just page by page, trying to remember my fingering.
Yeah.
It was awesome coming back to it. I love that you're still doing that,
good
John.
For you. Artley is actually a really good flute. So you should have a pretty decent flute there.
Yeah, well, I think so. I'm figuring out some interesting songs. Like my husband and I, we play in a band called Rocket to Uranus. Yes, really. And he plays the guitar, I sing, and sometimes they'll do some instrumentals like the song Tequila by the Ventures.
Yeah.
And I learned some of the melody of Tequila on my flute. So when we eventually start performing with that band again, I'm thinking, wouldn't that be fun to whip out my flute and play on one of those instrumentals? So
sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, we could talk music all day, but that is part of why we're here. But this is actually a great transition into the conversation, because I'm a believer that everything happens for a reason, and that the things that happen in our lives are all related to where we end up. So it's not so much the things that happen, but the way that we talk about them. And I'm curious to know when it was that music shifted for you, when you went from just playing the trumpet to choosing to go to college to play the trumpet. Like that's kind of an intensity when you choose to do that. What happened?
I was in junior high, and there was a guy who was 5 or 6 years old. I went to a small school, okay, and it was a private school. And, like I had 7 people in my graduating class, okay. So,
wow.
And most of these people also were part of a sports organization. So I knew him. There was a guy who was about 5 years older. His little brother was a friend of mine. And he was in this room playing Switched-on-Bach. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Switched-on-Bach, but it's Bach done on a Moog synthesizer. And I walked in, and that music just blew me away. I had taken trumpet in 4th grade. I started this private school in 7th, and I started taking piano just because I enjoyed music. I wasn't really thinking about it, but I heard that Switched-on-Bach, and it just shifted things for me. The piece there, the very first piece on there is called Sinfonia to Cantata number 29. And I love it so much, it's actually the ringtone on my phone.
Still.
Yeah.
Wow. Seventh grade.
Yeah. Well, that could have been eighth grade, but because I was thinking about studying math. I was always really good at arithmetic. Boy, algebra was another thing, but I was quick, and so I thought, well, I'm going to study math. Then that music just blew me away, and I started writing music and got really interested, and became just pretty much a classical music nerd junkie. That's all I ever listened to, and that really was the catalyst that got me to shift my thinking to I'm going to study music.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, that relationship between mathematics and music is very common. I know a lot of engineers, like software developers, that are musicians. So I find that really fascinating. So I'm imagining you walking into this room and hearing this symphony, this Bach. Do you remember the kid that introduced you to it, the older brother of your friend?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
What was it about him? I mean, clearly you had some appreciation, or you looked up to him in some way.
Oh, yeah,
do you remember
definitely.
that?
Yeah.
What was that relationship?
He himself is an amazing musician. In fact, I don't know if you've heard the game EverQuest. It's an older
Yes.
video game. He actually wrote the music for that for Sony. But at the time, he played trombone, he played guitar, he played piano, and was an incredible composer. He was probably a junior in college at the time, but this guy just phenomenal. He was going to actually develop video games that would help people teach music, to help them music. But this guy, he's probably still in the. I haven't really contacted him much over the last 10 years, but he's just, when it comes to music, he's there. He's just amazing. Yeah.
Wow. You think about the influence that young man had on you in such an instant moment, and then to continue that influence. I just got a chill. That's just
oh, really?
So cool. Well, think about it. There are so many times we don't know the influence we have on people. We can't. And he may know to a certain extent, but if he heard this, he'd probably be really surprised to hear how the intensity of that.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, we did a lot of. I remember we were practicing trying to get perfect pitch, because it was something that you could acquire. So I had done that with him, and I mean, we kind of worked together because we were both part of this organization for a while. So but he may be surprised to know that was the influence. But he was certainly a good influence, because he's just phenomenal. I mean, he could hear stuff, play it, write stuff. I mean, he was just incredible.
Well, we might just have to look him up. If you think about it, you want to share his name with me. We might just have to look him up.
It's Jay Barbeau, Barbeau. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and look him up and maybe add a link or something to see what was the name of the game again?
EverQuest.
I'll look that up, and we'll include a link in the show notes on my blog for this podcast episode. That's awesome. So now here you are, a music degree in hand for performance, teaching, fixing musical instruments. And somehow in the last 2 years, you ended up writing this book. And then is it out now, or is it soon to be published?
It is. Well, it's in e-form, right? Ebook right now. And I haven't. It's the second edition of my first book, which my first book is a paperback. And I have some available, but it's like, why do I sell my first edition when my second's so much better? So,
isn't that funny?
the second one is only available in an e-format right now. But that's kind of where I am.
Okay, so what's the name of the book?
The book is called Shame on Me: Healing a Life of Shame-Based Thinking.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about this transition between music and what did you do after you left fixing instruments and teaching trumpet? What was your in-between career?
Well, I ended up meeting somebody, and we got married. She had 3 kids, and we started a screen printing business and doing other ad promotions. we floundered for the longest time. Then I ended up finding another job, being a sales rep for a company that does products for high-end construction. And so I was working on that. Then in about 2000, that's when I went to work again, coming back to my music career for the music store in Las Vegas and doing repair. And I did it for about 4 years, where this other job that I was doing started taking off, and I was able to leave that. Not that I didn't like it. I just wasn't going to really make a lot of money in that field. And I had, I really enjoyed it. Don't get me wrong, but
but there are limits. There are limits to what you can accomplish in that position and the impact you can have.
Right.
Interesting. So you were in this high-end construction materials sales for a long time?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And then
20 years.
And then something shifted and you ended up becoming the shame doctor.
Yes.
What happened? I mean, there is obviously now, again, I've said this so many times in my episodes that I don't believe in light bulb moments. I believe everything is on a dimmer switch. Very rarely does something just happen. There are all kinds of little incidents that lead up, but then there is a story or a series of stories that bring that light bulb full on bright. So what's one of those stories?
Well, the shift started when my 22-year marriage fell apart.
Yes, not uncommon.
That's the catalyst.
Mm-hmm.
We were trying to get things going, and we had seen a therapist, and that was a waste of money. And then things started to get better, then they got worse. And so with one last hurrah, I reached out. I did a search for a couple of therapists. I found one, and funny story, which I relay in my book. I left him a message. He said, I'm sorry I can't get back to the phone, but I will get back to you within 24 hours. He never got back. And then about 36 hours later, he called me back and he was like, oh, I'm really sorry. And I'm sitting here thinking in my mind, you told me 24 hours. You didn't do it. I felt like just, tell him go pound sand and hang it up. But I thought, I'm going to go ahead and see him. He ended up being a huge inspiration for what I like to call my growth and transformation period. He provided me with the tools to help me understand where the issues were, what I refused to see, all these kinds of things. And that really, that connection with, again, he's Dr. Shannon Smith, that's really what inspired me to just completely take my life in a whole other direction.
Interesting. I'm sure that you have some vivid memories of those first couple of appointments with him where you left and had like those moments of deep processing of what happened in the room. Do you remember one of those in particular?
Well, yeah, the one that I like to call where the light really came on. I refer to it as my Independence Day. But I was 7 months into therapy. I had been progressing, and I could see things were going on. But in this particular meeting, I finally understood the idea of shame and what it really meant. Because people always say shame, guilt, and they like to put them together. In fact, some dictionaries, when you look at the definition, they don't really distinguish them the way they ought to be distinguished. And that's a big part of my practice, is knowing the difference between guilt and shame. But it's like I was sitting there, and basically, when I define shame, it's the negative things that we've come to believe about who we were and are. And it's the verbal noise that it only becomes shame when we accept it. And I realized in that meeting that it wasn't the things that people told me that were keeping me down. It was the fact that I believed those things that they told me that were keeping me down. And that was when the lights go on. And I record my sessions and I would listen to them over and over and over and over again. And this particular session was funny because I look back at that session as boom, the lights go on, right? But I listened to my voice months later and even years later, and I didn't seem to have that excitement like I do now. And I put it this way. I don't go to as many sports games anymore at night, but back in the day when they had those whatever lights, the lights, when they would go off, it took a couple of minutes for them to cool down, and then you turn them on and they'd start off really dull, and then they'd get brighter and brighter and brighter. Soon it got bright enough for the game to commence, but it wasn't 100% bright. And then you'd sit there watching the game, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, hey, the lights are on or full on. That's how I look at that day. The lights went on, but they were dim. Now I look at that day as wow, that was the instrumental day of change. But thinking back, and hearing my voice, I don't think I really fully got it until much later. But it was February 22nd, 2013. That's the
wow.
I call my Independence Day, where the lights came on.
Well, that's exactly as I said. That's exactly the dimmer switch thing. That that may have been the day, but it took time to process what you heard and what you thought of what you heard. And I'm a big believer in taking time to process these experiences. I think about when I heard a story similar to that with Stephen Magling about having this weird experience and walking away and not realizing until months later that experience was a trigger point, or, that was the experience that changed. I call it the pivotal moment story. But it's not till you look back that you can say, oh, that's when that happened.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love that that moment. And it's probably partly because you recorded all your sessions. So you have the date, when it happened.
I recorded it. I did a lot of journaling. I have 3 journals. I'll probably never read them all, but yeah. I wrote on a daily basis. And then when I started writing my book, I started writing it, but in January 1st of 2015, I said, okay, my New Year's resolution, which I rarely do, I'm going to complete this book. And I ended up finishing it on Christmas Day of that same year.
Wow.
Yeah, but I worked from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. because I had my day job. It's the only time I had to write. And I would write every day and sometimes throw away stuff. Like I ended up rewriting chapter 7 2 times, and it's the longest chapter. 3 times. Yeah. So it was tough. It's one of those things where, man, I just want to give up. And then you're all through, and you're like, but I persevered and got through, and I'm so glad I didn't, because even writing the book really did a lot. I mean, I even stayed in the very end of the book. Even if nobody ever reads a single word from this book, I still feel it has done me a lot of good, because it took my journey and it made me sit, like you say, and contemplate and think about it. Why did I react this way to shame? Why would I do these things? And we talk about these things in the moment, but we never really sit and reflect. Why did that happen? Why did I allow this person's to have this much influence over me? Those kinds of things. And
what was my role in it? Right.
Yeah. And writing is an excellent way to process all those things.
Absolutely. I know that I'm one of those people that needs to process on my own in my head for a while. And then I write and I externally process with somebody I trust. I know that that's the way that I process things that are changing me and that are changing the world through my experience with it. So I am really curious about this idea that you finally had this experience with self-reflection that innately changed who you are and how you respond to or react to external stimulation. And I say that because you said that the catalyst was this falling apart of your marriage. And I know that when we talked a few years ago, you were in a relationship with a woman. I don't know the status of that, but I'm curious about the moment when you realized that you had some influence in your relationships and that you had a choice about who you were going to bring to the relationship to make it healthy. And I asked that, and let me back up a little bit. I asked that because I worked with a guy a few years back, one of my coaching clients, and he had decided that he was just an asshole. He's just like, that's me. That's my authentic self. And I said, well, how's that working for you? He said, it's fine. I said, so your relationships are satisfying? And it got very quiet. And that's what was the moment where I said, you can have good relationships and you don't have to live with that asshole authentic self. You actually can choose to not be that. So I'm curious about when you noticed that in a relationship, whether it was at the very beginning or partway into a relationship, that happened for you.
My first relationship was all about my thinking. The way I grew up, my thinking was I need advice from somebody else because I'm not smart enough. I'm not okay. Yeah, I grew up in it was a religious organization, and following God and going to heaven, all these really big, and the way I was taught, listen to your spiritual leaders. So in a way, I never really felt like I was worthy enough to receive the answers directly from God. And what I didn't realize is that thinking it carried over into other areas in my life. How am I going to be a good musician? Tell me what I need to do. How am I going to be a good athlete? Tell me what I need to do. How am I going to be a good husband? Tell me what I need to do. And so I ended up not really being myself, but trying to find out what my partner wanted to be. She'd ask me, where do you want to go for dinner? And my thought was, where am I going to choose that's going to make her happy? Now that wasn't her fault so much, but that's the way I developed. And her particular weaknesses, we sort of nurtured each other's weaknesses. She became strong, and again, I don't want to get into hers. I will say nothing to put her down or whatever she learned is her lesson. What I learned, I'll be happy to. I have no problem telling people what I learned. But so here I am at 52 years old and really didn't even know who I was. So when I finally got to realize that I could choose these things, I had never really been in a relationship like that. I still am in that current relationship, by the way, which we've talked about, and we both, if we argue, it's usually about the other person's concern. I don't want you to get up and have to worry about it. I don't want, and we argue for the other person's comfort. And right. We've constantly, this is going to be the way we are the rest of our lives, because we're that much concerned about one another. So the relationship, it's really hard to imagine, because putting myself where I am now back into my marriage, it's like there's so many things different. It's like a different guy, So it's kind of hard to really pinpoint what you're asking, because the whole idea of shame and I'm not worthy, when you think, wow, you are. Now it's how do you almost see yourself? I was sitting with my therapist one day, and he says, what do you enjoy? And I'm like, I can't even tell you. If you had to hold a gun to my head, I would say I want to go parachuting. That's what I said, right? And then I also said, but I'm too old for that. And then and I said that because my ex told me that I was too old for that, right?
Right.
So one of my assignments that he said, okay, John, your assignment is to go parachuting. And I went, and it was one of the best experiences that I ever had. And it's really difficult to kind of put myself where I am now back 10, 12 years ago in my mind. I can see my mindset, understand why I would do things, But now it's completely, I would never fall back into that situation again. I just couldn't.
I think about an experience early on with my husband. We've been together 26, 27 years, something like that. And he's a dozen years older than I am. And I was 25 when we met. I remember I was probably 26 when we were on the highway going up from Washington, D.C. up toward Wilmington, Delaware to go see my aunt. And it was after work. We were going to have dinner with her, but we had waited until I think 7 to leave because we knew if we left at 5, it would take us 2 hours to get there in traffic. If we left at 7, it would take us 1. So, we'll just leave at 1 or at 7 and not get stuck in traffic and actually, get there faster, earlier than we would have otherwise in some cases. But anyway, we're driving on the highway and I'm really hungry and I can feel myself getting hangry, right? My attitude is dropping. My energy is dropping. I'm starting to get headachy. And I said to my husband, boyfriend at the time, I said, gosh, I'm really hungry. He said, yeah, me too. And we pass the exit to one of those roadside places that has all the different fast food restaurants. And I looked at him and I was like, and in my head, why didn't he stop? I just told him I was hungry. So then we're coming up to another exit and I see the sign and I say it again, I am so hungry. And he said, yeah, me too. And we drove right by the exit. And now I'm angry. Like, why didn't he stop? I mean, goodness, why didn't he stop? I just told him I was hungry. And then as we're coming up to a third exit, and now we're still 40 minutes at least away from my aunt's, and I don't know if she's going to have dinner ready. I'm frustrated. I'm shaky. And I finally, this light bulb went on in my head again, this whole dimmer switch, slowly but surely. And I said, I'm really starting to get headachy. Will you pull off at the next exit where there's a McDonald's? I just need a burger. Just one of those little tiny junior hamburgers just to get the edge off. And he's like, yeah, sure. And we pull off, we grab my little burger. We're back on the road in 8 minutes or however long it took. And I remember that moment. I remember it so vividly. I simply wasn't using my words. Yeah. I was expecting him to deduce that I wanted him to stop. Instead of just saying, hey, could you stop so I can grab a bite? Mm-hmm. I was expecting him to read my mind. And ever since then, every time I find myself getting annoyed by something, 25 years later, 27 years later, I'll say, would you, this was one of the examples. I was shifting offices again when I was working for the state. And I said, this is the 3rd time I'm shifting cubicles and I hate these cubicles. It sure would be nice if some flowers were delivered after I moved into this new cube. And I told one of my guy friends that I had told my husband that. He goes, damn, I wish my wife would tell me when she wanted stuff like that. And 2 days later, flowers were delivered to my cubicle because I told him what I needed from him. And so that's what I'm thinking in terms of those moments where you realize that you have a role in that relationship beyond pleasing the other person, but getting your needs met in a way that is fair and reasonable.
I always view things through the lens of shame. That's the one thing that, I talk about in my book where it's like I'm looking through sunglasses and everything I see comes through these glasses, right? But these sunglasses sort of have a filter of this idea of shame. And so it all gets perceived through this idea from the unworthiness side of shame. Because again, shame gives you feelings that range from total unworthiness to complete arrogance. Mm-hmm. And so, mine has always tended toward the unworthiness side. So everything that comes through, it's like, okay, well, am I worthy for this? Whatever question to put myself down, kind of things. And in my current relationship, we both have that sort of well, my needs aren't that important. And so we don't say anything. And consequently, we're in that car passing the exit. and we both tend to be that way. When if I would have just said, you know what I'd like to do, or if she said, you know what I'd like, perfect. And now it's like, I'll tell, look, I'm going to the store. Tell me what you want me to get. And that's fine. I don't have any problem. Get what you want, but just tell me, please.
Exactly. Use your words. Please use your words. I think that's really interesting when you talk about that from that point of shame, because you caught my attention when you said it usually goes either one direction or the other, toward the unworthiness or to the arrogance, which is that false sense of confidence.
Correct.
And I see that a lot in, particularly in men, but I see it in women as well. So I'm curious, when you've seen that show up, what does that look like?
When I see it show up in me?
In the arrogance side. I don't know if that shows up in you, but in maybe one of your clients, or another story that you've experienced with somebody else who struggles with shame and doesn't know it yet. The arrogance, see, that's the issue with the arrogance side, is because you have this feeling that you're right. So when you're always right, how do you know when you're wrong? There was one thing in my life where I was truly arrogant, and I'll share that to give an understanding. And that was with the religion that was involved in this organization. I mean, it didn't matter if you were a Christian. If you didn't follow it the way we established it, you were going to hell. And it was, it was bad. It was bad. I remember, even being a coach there, I remember when there was a gentleman there who had a stepson who was a really good athlete. And I knew he was a stepfather, and he tried really hard. But this guy had long hair, looked like he played in a rock band, was smoking. And he came up to me one time and he wanted to talk about his son. And I distinctly remember in my mind thinking, man, it's too bad this guy's going to hell. Hugely judgmental. And that arrogant side, it gets you to a point where even though it's a false confidence, you don't even want to accept that it's not, because that's what you're covering up. I'm better than what people think they perceive me as, or I don't want them to perceive me as this, so I'm going to put this air on that makes me better, because I don't want them to know really how little I think of myself. But they typically don't get to the how little I think of myself, because they just believe it's true. Because a lot of times the arrogance gets them to work harder, so they might succeed, they might make more money, and this succeeding, this other people tell them, wow, yes, doing a good job, it only pats them on the back for being arrogant. It feeds it, right?
Yeah. So there's no reason to look at it. When now again, I'm not saying that pushing and all these things are detrimental, but it can be. It can be a distraction. I don't even want to think about how little I think about myself, so I'm going to put all my efforts into this, because if I can get this thing to grow, that'll prove that I'm that way. When the only thing you need to prove is to yourself.
Right.
And that's the difficulty with the arrogant side of shame. How do you show somebody that when they're already fighting against themselves, wanting to not to even want to think about it?
Right.
I got one other example. You mind if I share it?
Yes, please do.
So basically, in my first marriage, I loved my ex, but I didn't really love her enough to be in a relationship with her. That's what I deduced, right? But things happened. Things started to really hit the fan in May of 2011. But if you'd have come to me, Sarah, in April and said, John, I don't really think you love your wife, I would have objected. What do you mean? There's no man who's been married to their wife for 22 years that doesn't love her as much, if not more, than I do. Nobody, right? Because why? What kind of a horrible person would I be to be with somebody for 22 years and not love them as much or more than anybody? That whole idea of what a horrible person I would be, I didn't even want to contemplate the fact that I really, really didn't love her. And those are the kinds of things where we got to be honest with ourselves. And it's not easy. I mean, who wants to go, yeah, I'm so proud of myself for understanding that I'm an idiot and I really didn't love we just,
right.
We're just not looking
It hurts.
to those. Yeah.
Right. It's painful to self-reflect like that and to have to acknowledge that you're not great or that you are human.
Bingo.
Wow, that's an awesome example. Thank you for sharing that. That's
Sure.
And a painful example, and absolutely accurate. I've seen that where you just have so much invested in that false person, in that sense of self, that by acknowledging something is off, it feels like you've wasted all this time. And that you're not the person you thought you were. And ouch, that's awful. It's an awful feeling.
The interesting thing with shame is a lot of times you say, okay, how do I know I'm overcoming it? And when you can take your past faults, abuses, whatever it is, instead of letting them hold you down, you use them for a springboard to do better. So I look at myself as shame, not worthy, all these things. Everything is wrong with me, right? I mean, there was a point where there's a verse in the Bible in James where, no one is good, only God is good. Where I got to a point where, well, maybe the worse I feel about myself, the more I'm going to please God, which is the perfect environment for shame to thrive, right? So I look at myself as I'm this shameful person. Well, now, when I see something that's wrong with me, it's really easy to, hey, let me take a look. Because I can accept that. Because for so many years, I thought that way. Well, let me look and really see if it's true. Let me take. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't bother me to admit my mistakes or my faults. In fact, I got to be careful sometimes, because if you admit too much, people go, this guy's got too much wrong with him. I don't want him to help me. But it doesn't bother me. I'll lay it out on the table. But again, that's not a good marketing strategy. But it's okay. I
don't know. I would disagree with that.
Okay.
Not that, because of the way that it's approached. It's not, these are all the things that are wrong with me. It's, here's something that I noticed about myself that I have to decide if it's something I want to keep, or if it's something that is damaging me internally or damaging my relationships.
Sure.
So for instance, I think about this in terms of our 30s, because it seems like a lot of us go through this interesting time in our 30s where we start to realize these things about ourselves to be true, that are true, the things we've been fighting in our 20s, trying to be something different because we see something in ourselves and we see other people that we admire and we want to be more like them. So that's the 20s. The 30s is when we start to resign ourselves to who we are. That's my theory. And it seems that when we get to that point where we just decide, okay, I'm talkative. I talk a lot. That's who I am. I remember doing that in my 30s and thinking, okay, I can acknowledge that now. And it wasn't until my 40s that I started to embrace it and understand that, yes, you can be a talkative person and you can learn to listen really well. You can be both. But it wasn't until my 40s until I started realizing that. So I love that you acknowledge these things that aren't perfect about you, that you don't necessarily see as perfection. And yet it's the way that you approach these things that make you such a good coach, so good at what you do, is that you take that step back and think about it. Is this something that I like about myself? Is this something that's serving me? Anyway, that's what I'm thinking as you're speaking.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And I think it's the only way that we can serve others is to approach those things in ourselves that way. I mean, the whole point of coaching is self-reflection, right? That's the whole point of what we do with our clients, is to guide people toward healthy self-reflection. Mm. And if we can't do it ourselves,
Right.
So as we kind of come full circle back to the whole idea of music playing a role in who you are, how you think, how you listen, because we started there. I'd love to hear a recent story about how music, particularly because I know you still play with the symphony, how music has maybe influenced how you coach or how you think about self-reflection and shame. My guess is that there are times when that is very front and center in your head, that application.
I have to take some time to reflect on that question.
Yeah, of course.
You starting off as somebody as who's a composer, and also very, very influenced by the classical music realm and not really much in popular music. I'll listen to, like, for instance, we're playing Mahler's First Symphony, and Mahler was a very philosophical kind of a composer, a lot of kind of stuff. So I'll listen for those kinds of things, but a lot of time it's just how it makes me feel. If I'm working at my desk and I get tired, I'll put on a piece that I know is gonna get my blood going, and in a positive way, in an inspirational
awakens
way.
You, right?
Yeah. But as far as my reflection, I don't know. I for me, most of it is done when I write, and like you say, you like to mull it over in your head, and then you put it on paper. When I put it on paper, that's when I'm mulling it over, because thankfully with word processing, it's not a typewriter anymore. We can go back and change without having a lot of strike throughs and all those kind of corrections. Because you probably know I post articles on a weekly basis, and sometimes I'll go back and read something that I've done. And I'm like, wow, I wrote that. I mean, I kind of impress myself, but that the actual writing is really where more of the reflection and the philosophical aspects, that's where it really seems to mold itself more than an influence from music. If that's okay to answer that way.
Of course. The reason I ask is that as a musician myself, what I find is that when I can separate myself from my thoughts by singing, because mine is all lyrics, so I can't be thinking about my work and my clients while I'm singing Black Coffee by Julie London, right? All I'm thinking about is the soulful lyrics in that song. And the reason I asked you that question is because I need that time to be soulful without my own crazy hamster on the wheel in my brain kind of going, because that's my MO. Almost as soon as I'm awake, I have a hamster running in my brain and I can't shut it down. So being able to, even when I'm hiking, that's when I'm processing, as opposed to writing like you do. I process when I'm hiking. That's where all of my thoughts start to develop some clarity. But I need that break in music to be able to be fully present when I'm working with a coaching client. So that's why I asked, because I know that music plays a big role in my life, in how I apply it, even with the work that I do. So, and your answer is just fine. It totally makes sense to me.
The interesting thing is too, because music, and the funny thing about me, lyrics oftentimes get in the way. Mm-hmm. And so I prefer a lot of times words without lyrics. But when I'm working on something that takes concentration, I can't, like writing, I can't have music going on because being a former composer, I'll hear something and I'll listen for the chord progression, I'll listen for the way it's arranged, and it distracts me from what I'm doing. And I'm really easily distracted, and I'm not very good at multitasking, or what Melissa Hughes calls it, multi-switching. But
multi-switching, right?
Yeah, she doesn't believe that multitasking is possible, and I agree with her. But that's a whole other story. But I'm really bad at it, so I can't. I got to close my door. I have to have silence when I'm doing something that really, like I say, takes a focus, like writing, or if I'm working some kind of mathematical kind of stuff with what I'm doing. I can't listen to music because it'll just take me right out.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we all process things differently. We all need different stimulants around us or not having stimulants around us to be able to focus. My husband's more like you. He needs quiet and like all focus time to be able to do his writing, where if I am sitting in a coffee shop and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on around me, that's when I get my most incredible work done.
Yeah.
So opposites. So John, just to wrap this up, let's come to kind of I don't know if you have another story you want to share about your book, or if you want to just share with our audience, with the listeners, how people can get a hold of you, where they can get your book, anything else you would want listeners to know, either about you or about the work that you do.
Well, thank you very much. If you don't mind, my website is shamedoctor.com. So that's kind of easy to remember. There is a button on there where it says buy the book. And there's also you can sign up for my weekly newsletter. And my email is john@shamedoctor.com. Those are the best ways to get a hold of me. And I really enjoyed writing this, redoing the second edition. And I don't know if you know Susan Rooks from LinkedIn.
Of course.
But she edited my book. And another nice connection from LinkedIn. And she's actually one of my biggest promoters for the book. But I really enjoyed rewriting it, and I have plans for the future, which I won't divulge now for a lot more writing, because I just feel that writing just seems to be the gift even more. It's really actually overcoming my music. To the point where I think I'm going to have to stop playing pretty soon, because I'm going to be spending so much time working on this, on the writing aspect, and developing little workbooks for people who are in particular situations, like in toxic relationships, that they can help get out of those things. That's where my focus is going to be, not just on the shame aspect, but the healing. That's another huge part, which we really didn't get into, but we talk so much about healing, but what does it mean? How does it happen? And people rarely delve into those answers.
Well, and they have to start by acknowledging the shame in the first place, which I think that's kind of what your first book is allowing people that space to acknowledge that, to know that what they are experiencing is shame, as opposed to guilt or imposter syndrome or other things that it could be. Just being able to put a word to it. I think a lot about grief in that way, that if you can put the word grief to something you're experiencing, then you can start to heal. But you can't do it until you name it. And so I think that was my experience with working with you, hearing about what you were working with, reading some of your articles. So I haven't read the book yet, but I will be reading it. And so thank you for writing it. I know that it will serve a great purpose, and it already has.
Thank you.
Well, this has been lovely. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. It really has been great. I've really enjoyed it, Sarah.
Absolutely. And just so our listeners know, I will have all those links that John mentioned, theshamedoctor.com, and the click here for his book, to buy his book. I will have all those links in the show notes on my website, elkinsconsulting.com.
Are you ready to start your story portfolio so you have the right story ready to share when the opportunity presents itself? When you're ready to get started, my book, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, is available in all the regular places, and the audiobook version is available on Google Play and on my website, elkinsconsulting.com. As a special bonus for listeners, the audiobook includes 2 songs recorded by my band, Spare Change, in my living room in Montana. Also on my website is a free podcast interview checklist. It's available to download to make sure you make the most out of your next podcast interview. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to rate the podcast and leave a review, and let me know that you've done it so I can thank you properly. Thank you.